Welcome back to Tall Ship Tuesdays. I am Captain John Paul Jones, finally back here aboard Providence in my captain's cabin. Today, I would like to share with you another story from our Young Patriots novel book. Today's story is Across the Delaware by Marcella Fisher Anderson. On Christmas night, 1776, James held his dog Scout close to him and raised his head above the side of the boat where he was hiding. Cargo rafts, ferries, and iron ore carriers crowded close to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. James looked across to the New Jersey shore. Through the snow, he tried to see a candle burning in his mother's pantry window. Suddenly, a strong hand grabbed his damp collar. "What are you doing here?" a sentry whispered harshly. "And a dog besides. Keep him quiet and follow me." "I've only one mind, sir, to cross the river for home," said James, hurrying to follow the sentry to his commanding officer. "I found him, I did, in one of the boats, sir." "Give him your name, lad." "James Morris." Remembering that his father had fought bravely against the British and died at White Plains, James added, "Patriot." The officer's gaze softened. "Well, James Morris, you have discovered us in the midst of a surprise crossing of the Delaware tonight. You will have to come with us. Scout and I have crossed the river many times." "Muzzle that dog, O'Hara," the officer said to the sentry, "and put them both next to the helmsman on the first boat. Young Morris may be useful." In the stern of the boat, James rubbed Scout's nose where the rag strip was tied to keep him from barking. James thought of home, and the October day he and his mother had learned of his father's death. Soon afterward, his mother had sent James across the river to her parents' farm, thinking the change would be good for him. But James knew now that had been the wrong thing for him to do. He had never fully faced the facts of his father's death. He knew he should go home, but he was still afraid. Afraid to face the empty chair and the dark hearth where his father had always built a high fire. A better one than James felt he could ever make. "A fine way to spend Christmas night," said the helmsman quietly, interrupting James's thoughts. "A hard crossing even with us fishermen, from the Marblehead man in the boats." "Where did all the boats come from?" asked James softly. "From Captain Daniel Bray and other men," whispered the helmsman. "On Washington's orders, they stole the boats at night, floated them downriver here, and then hid them. 2,400 men are crossing tonight. We'll thrash those Hessians at Trenton." James heard the clatter of horses coming aboard, then felt a lunge beneath him as the boat was poled and rowed out into the river. "The current will be swiftest closer to the other shore," he warned the helmsman. Scout stirred in James's arms. Presently, a faint glow shone from Johnson's ferry house dead ahead. Close to land now, the Marbleheaders fought against the current. As the boats neared the opposite bank, men in the dark reached for the mooring lines. James stared. "Tories," he said aloud. He recognized them as his mother's neighbours, who supported Britain's king. James's heart stopped. "It's no treachery, young Morris," said one of the men, grasping his horse's bridle. "We no longer trust the British. We are patriots now. Except for Croc. Strange one he is." He gestured to a heavy-set man slinking into the shadows. Alarmed, James watched the Tory, Croc, disappear into the woods. Sentries chased after him, but James knew that Croc could evade them. Leaving Scout unmuzzled and snuffling about the guarded ferry house, James started tracking the Tory. Snow alternated with sleet. A strong wind carried the sound of a church bell. 1 a.m. The crossing was taking longer than planned, moving the surprise attack into daylight hours. James's head throbbed. 2 miles, from tree to tree. He followed the spy Croc until at last the Tory headed for the ice-covered rock ledges that James himself climbed in summer to take the shortcut to Trenton. James circled swiftly down around the rocks, reaching the ledges just as Croc stretched for one last handhold. He stepped on the man's hands. Up or down, Tory? James's heart pounded. What would he do now? The man's lips parted over his teeth. Rebel vermin, Croc muttered as he tried to free his hands. There was a movement in the woods below, and suddenly a brown bundle of energy growled its way up the rocks and leaped, fastening itself onto the man's ankle. Croc's eyes widened in surprise. Off, beast, he cried, losing his handhold and grazing the rocks as he fell backward onto the snow below. James tore down and around the ledges, reaching the man as he staggered to his feet and rocked unsteadily. March, Tory, James said, prodding the dazed man with a sharp, heavy stick he had picked up off the ground. The rebels will not succeed tonight, Croc laughed, swaying a little. Their muskets are too wet to fire. He twisted his head and spat at James's feet. James prodded him harder in the ribs. Back to the river, traitor. From Johnson's ferry house, the lantern shone with icy brilliance. Croc lunged to escape. James stretched out his stick and tripped him. The Tory struggled to regain his footing, but slipped on the ice-crusted snow. With a bellow, he rolled helplessly down the hill to the river. Scout and James ran beside him. A familiar sentry rushed from behind the ferry house. Guard him, O'Hara, James shouted with triumph that rang in the frozen air. He's a spy. I know him well. Soon, in the early light, James slogged wearily home. He paused at his father's garden where dry cornstalks rattled in the wind. He thought about the times he and his father had laughed and hidden from each other in the rows of tall corn. Remembering brought hot tears to James's eyes. But James took a deep breath and, with Scout following, crossed the yard toward the candle in the window. It was time to be here to help his mother. Time to face the empty chair and the hearth. James knew that he could do that now. It was time to be home. I thank you for joining me today for another Young Patriot story. I hope it inspires you to aid the American cause in your own ways in your daily life. I thank you very much, and I must bid you farewell now. A good day.